Thank you, Sue, and welcome to everyone from around the world. My name is Jeff Hull. I'm the Executive Director at the Institute of Coaching, and I want to welcome you for afternoon or evening or good morning, whatever part of the world you're joining us. Please take a minute to say hello in the chat. I can see we have folks coming in from all over the world already, so hello from DC, hello from Ohio, hello from Maryland, hello from Barcelona. Wonderful. So say hello from wherever you are. I want to welcome you here to today's webinar, Better Conversations, Curating Purpose, Possibilities, and Progress with the Dialogic Orientation Quadrant, which sounds really, really scientific and interesting, and I happen to know for a fact that it is all of the above. So I am really excited to be here today with one of our founding fellows at the Institute of Coaching, one of our thought leaders, and Haesun Moon, who's been busy writing a wonderful new book, and she has decided to join us today to share some of her insights from the book. And so we are going to have a really exciting conversation around this framework that she has studied, researched, and designed and worked with over many years to help us have really positive and useful and progressive conversations in coaching, scientifically based. So for those of you that don't know Haesun, let me give you a little bit of her background. She is a communication scientist by training. She's an educator and trainer. She's an executive coach. And she's the author of this wonderful new book called Coaching A to Z, The Extraordinary Use of Ordinary Words. But she's also the author of other books, including Thriving Women, Thriving World as a collaborator, and also Foundations of Brief Coaching, where she teaches brief coaching at the University of Toronto and serves as the executive director of the Canadian Centre for Brief Coaching. She's also a principal at the Human Learning Institute, and as I said before, a great friend of the Institute of Coaching. So I'm really excited to have Haesun with us here today, and I want to encourage everyone to put questions as they come up for you in the Q&A box, because Haesun has agreed to spend quite a bit of time in dialogue, since that's her specialty, with the audience. And feel free to make comments in the chat box, and we will get to as many of the questions as we can. So without further ado, welcome to my dear friend, Haesun.
Hello. My goodness, so good to be here.
It's good to have you.
It's amazing when nowadays when people join like Zoom, they know what to do without even being prompted. They're like, hello from Toronto, hello from here. Hey, thank you for doing that, everyone.
It's great. We have people from all over the world.
I know, look at that. And I just saw somebody from Washington, Dubai. Hey, welcome. Oh, that's so cool. And I think also, Jeff, thank you for actually possibly planting the seed of a human leaning institute. I like leaning too, actually. Human learning, human leaning. I think it's very similar.
Did I say human leaning institute?
You self-edited. Thank you. And for those of you who actually have pets, you know, I turned off all the digital notifications, but the analogs ones like dogs. So you're going to actually hear them bark. And I was actually going to say, people like, you know, Jeff who have cats, you don't have to worry about this. And then Jeff was like, you don't understand this. You will see the tail moving. And I thought it was hilarious because what we're going to talk about today actually includes both audible and visible communications. So audible is like dog barking. Visible is the cat tail passing through. So anyway, good to be here.
Welcome.
Let me see if I can actually share the screen so that I can show you a couple of things. Let me see. There you go. Let me know if you can actually see the slides. And I think the topic today is very interesting, as Jeff was saying. This is really about how do we actually host better conversations or a dialogue? And it's done by, it's not, when you think about a really good dialogue, sometimes it comes by chance, but also a lot of times we design them so. So today will be about how do we curate stories of purpose, possibilities and progress. And I love that, Jeff, thank you so much for that great introduction to the Dialogic Orientation Quadrant. And if you're thinking, what? We're going to actually get to it, so don't worry. So here is the presentation that I'm going to share with you. And before we do that, oh, by the way, let me go back and show you. Actually, you can see it on this slide too. So things that we're going to talk about today includes the baseline. So baseline is where you are today, like right now, before you actually sit through this presentation. And then after that, we're going to talk about purpose, possibilities, and progress. And we're going to check in on your learning by going back to our baseline. So that's a very simple structure that we have. So here's a baseline. What do you do when you're beginning your conversation, whether you're a coach or a clinician or even a therapist, when you're sitting, or maybe even a parent, right? So when you sit down with somebody, how do you begin your conversation? And I actually just put 3 different scenarios here. First scenario is they booked this appointment with you. Maybe it's your student, maybe it's it's your patient, client, and they booked it. And you don't know much about them yet. And this is your first meeting. What will be your opening line? Feel free to just write down somewhere, or if you're driving or something, don't write down, think what you might say. And here's a second scenario, as you're thinking about the first one, and take your time, it's fine. Second context is your client, let's say, they're nominated with a quotation marks. So nominated or mandated to see you. And you know a little bit about them because you talked to the person who nominated them. So it's kind of like you do have a little bit of background file on them, and this is your first meeting. How would you begin your conversation? Okay, would it be different than the first? Just don't overthink it. How would you just begin other than hello, nice to meet you and all that stuff? And then what will be your very first inquiry to their context? And here's your third scenario. Here, this is your baseline, by the way. So really, you can just come up with what you normally do so that we're going to actually look at it together. Don't put it in the chat box, okay? Because otherwise we're going to judge you. Here's a third one. Now, your client or patient or student, they're coming back for a follow-up session with you after some time. You've seen them before, but they're coming back to see you. And you know them a little bit. Now, how would you begin that conversation? That this is somebody that, is someone that you already know, you've met, and they're coming back. How would you like to begin your session? If your leader, your staff, they come back to you, maybe every week, almost every day, then how do you actually start your conversation with them? Okay, so that's your baseline for your beginning. And how about this one? We're still doing the baseline, by the way. So in case you're thinking, here's your client, and client says something like this in session. Client says, well, it's been a whirlwind of change. I can't sustain this. I'm reaching that breaking point, and I don't want to let anyone down, but I just got to fill my cup first. There are so many things that I need to do and want to do, but you got to be realistic here. Okay? Your client says that to you in the middle of your coaching conversation, or maybe it's your patient, student. Now, how would you respond to this person at this point? What would you say? What would you do? Some of you might say, oh, just get up and hug them. I don't know. So what would you do? How would you respond to this client at this point? Come up with maybe a few different, maybe I might say this. Maybe I might say this. So come up with some ideas that you may have. Okay. And I tell you, I show you this because we're going to come back to this and we're going to check if we might actually respond any different at the end of our time together here. So yes, here's the thing that's called DOQ, huge name for such a simple model, but something that I can tell you is this is a listening compass. This is not a questioning compass. Sometimes people use it as oh, let's come up with a question that fits in the model. This is about what the client says, and you're going to use this map to map what the client says. So I'm going to show you how it works. You see how easy this is? This is a simple tool, and that's why I had to give it such a complicated name so that it can be taken seriously. So if you see, there's two lines, one from left to right. And left to right is, you see, for those of you who are not seeing the screen, I'll actually describe what you see here. So here's a arrow from left to right, which is highlighted in yellow. And that's people come to you when your clients, students, patients come to you, kids, they come to you and tell you something that happened in the past. And they also tell you that something might happen in the future. Past could be right before they just walk in the door, could all the way to when I was born. Actually, some people tell you, well, before I was born, story too, that's all part of the past. Also, some people will tell you, well, the future could be right after they leave talking to me, when they go upstairs or when they go back to their life, all the way to when I die or, after I die, 100 years from now. So future narrative is a timeline. So you see the horizontal line, this is a timeline. And when we also listen to what people say in their narrative, we have a vertical line that's intersecting the horizontal line. And people will tell you something that they prefer to see more and something that they want to see less. Top is they want to see something happening more. Bottom of that arrow is something that they want to see less. So when you see those intersecting two lines, you get a quadrant. And when you look at the quadrant, let's say of, what is this? Upper right, is that what it is? Yes, upper right. So upper right is when people tell you something that they prefer to see happen more in their future. It's quadrant 1, which is top right corner. And this is called preferred future, not perfect future, by the way. It's just preferred future. It would be nice to have. And then going counterclockwise, I guess, is when you look at something that people say, then you know what? It could be experiences, interactions, thoughts, feelings, and all those things that they're like, yeah, that was really nice. That actually happened. Now, this is what we call resourceful past. And that's quadrant 2. And that's, upper left? Is that what it is? Yes. And then the third one is right below that is bottom left is things that happened in the past. All of us have this. Things that happened in our past, maybe this morning, maybe like just before the meeting, or just maybe yesterday. Something happened and you're like, oh, yeah, that wasn't my favorite part of the day. Or it could be small t trauma, big T trauma, for those of you who might be living in certain parts of the world, experiencing violence and so on. It could be big T trauma, ongoing trauma, or it could be an incident. Things like that happen, and we call that troubled past. Sometimes it's also known as a regretful past or traumatic past, but I think troubled past might actually capture them all, especially in the coaching context. And then the last quadrant to its right, so which is bottom right, is something that people are worried about. Something that, actually I have a puppy, and I didn't know that I was an anxious person until I got this puppy. And I have another dog and, adult dog. So first 6 weeks, I was so terrified that if I leave the house, something might happen to them. That kind of worry, that anxiety is the dread. So that's quadrant 4, which is dreaded future. It could be, actually, it's not necessarily a bad things happening. Some people actually dread about moving to a new house or getting promoted. And sometimes they actually really dread some parts of that happening in their future. And that is quadrant 4, dreaded future. And let me ask you, where do you think, I think many of you know this already, that where do you think our home is usually? Where do we live? I mean, where do you live anyway? I mean, I can tell you that my home is quadrant 4. I live in dreaded future. And knowing this coaching thing really is a lifesaver every day. because then I know how to shift it in my head without ignoring those signals that, hey, you got to pay attention to this. So I don't ignore it, but I know that staying in, exploring further, or going deeper in quadrant 4 may not be the healthiest thing. And when you think about some people around you, some people live in their troubled past. Do you know somebody who actually talks about, 40 years ago, or 20 years ago, and they just keep rehashing things that was not pleasant, and and those things that happen, and it seems like they didn't really sort of grow out of it, or they're still struggling with it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a response that we have to trauma many times. It comes back. And then now, some of us, we live there more comfortably than other quadrants. So where is your home? Sometimes when I ask this question, especially in the coaching community, there's somebody says, I think I live in quadrant 1, preferred future. And I think if that's the case, I think you need to see a therapist. But anyway, here's a question though. When we are working with our clients as coaches, let's say, okay, or maybe we're working with our staff members as a leader, when we're working with our team members as a colleague, after we are having this coaching conversation, where do you think that our client or conversational partner should be actually orienting their attention to? After we have a conversation with them, would they be paying more attention to their dreaded future or troubled past? Or would they be actually noticing more of their preferred future or resourceful past? And this is a question for all of you, because sometimes we will say, many coaches will say, oh, of course, we actually do the shift of people paying attention to preferred future and resourceful past. That's what we believe that we do. And you know that word efficacy, right? So process efficacy is, if you think this is what we do, let's see if that's what we actually do. So it's so useful to ask ourselves, what do you think you do in your coaching practice? Which quadrant do you think you get your clients to look at more? And then you pick a quadrant and you're like, I think this is what I do. Well, let's see your videotape of coaching session and see if that's actually what's happening. So this tool actually is a very useful tool for researchers as well. And before we go back to our baseline, I want to do a little check-in so that you kind of remember these quadrants. So do you remember what quadrant 1 was called? The whole quadrant, yeah, it's called preferred future. Remember that? Quadrant 2 is things that people want more, that they liked from the past, called resourceful past. Yes? And quadrant 3, by the way, you're going to get a copy of these slides as PDF afterwards, so don't worry about scribbling down, especially if you're driving. And quadrant 3 is things that they didn't like from the past, called troubled past. And then last one is something that might happen in the future that, oh, I'm so dreading. Is dreadful future or dreaded future. Yes. And it's so interesting because when we actually look at a quadrant like this, and something interesting happens when we apply the quadrant to some of the questions that we ask in the beginning. Remember the baseline? I asked you, hey, what would you say if you are, sitting down with this person in this context? How would you begin your session? And I'm giving 3 different examples here, but look at your own example that you thought about or you wrote about. What did you say in your question? And because of your question, what is your question actually orienting your clients to look at? Which quadrant do you think your client is more likely to answer based on your question? Some of you might have said, how can I help you? Or maybe some of you said, so what's going on? What's on your mind? What brought you here? Those 3 are, by the way, very popular questions in coaching and therapy. What brought you here? How can I help you? What's on your mind? And when you think about, just take one, how can I help you? The positioning of our client is then, you need help. So the assumptions in your questioning will orient your client, because the client will very likely say, well, if you can help me with this, because they just accepted and built on your assumptions, right? So here is a purpose piece. When you're meeting with somebody, initial curiosity is about, so what's the purpose of them coming to talk to me? It's not about what can we do together, but what's the purpose, that what kind of positive difference would they want to see after having this conversation? So for example, these are 3 examples I wrote down here. I'll read it for you for those of you who may not see the screen. So first one is telling your clients, especially if this is your first time meeting them, and simply inviting them to think about, you must have a very good reason to book this appointment with me. And how would you know that this was really useful for you as you go back to your work, or as you go back to your day-to-day interactions with people around you? Now think about, what is your client, where do you think they will be orienting their attention to when you actually invite them to think about this? How would you know that this was useful for you? They will tell you probably from, well, I will know this was useful if I can do this. We're talking about quadrant 1. What about the second bullet point? Especially, this is very useful if somebody was nominated to come and see you, and there's another person who has a say in this. Sometimes in therapy settings, court mandated is the case. Or a lot of times for me, a board can mandate CEOs or C-level leaders to come and see me. And then I cannot pretend that, oh, that didn't happen. I need to really acknowledge that that actually has happened, because they know that too. Then I might simply say, so what might be some positive effects of us having this conversation that, they might actually start to notice? It's a very honest invitation. But I'm asking about the positive effect as a result of our meeting together, which is still quadrant 1, isn't it? And then here's a third one. And possibly also somebody who may not be sure about why they are here. And how do we clarify the purpose of them being here? It can sound something like this. So suppose this turns out to be useful for you. What might you be doing or thinking or feeling that you may not be doing right now? And I can actually ask all of you here, by joining today's talk. Maybe you're not expecting something like this, but by joining, somehow suppose this session today that you are in right now with me turns out to be really useful for you. What might you be doing or thinking or feeling differently than you are right now? It's interesting, eh? You can actually use this in your teaching moments as well if you're teaching too. So you can see initial purpose is usually around the quadrant 1. And here's a possibility piece, because remember that client narrative that I just showed you? And the client actually says, it's been a whirlwind of change, and so on and so forth. Now, the quadrant, so we can do a little bit of analysis here. Which quadrant would you put? It's been a whirlwind of change. What quadrant do you think this belongs in? So you can actually look at it by, do they want it or not want it? Do they want the whirlwind? I don't think so. Then you know that it's kind of like below the quadrant, because the bottom quadrants are something that they don't want. It's been a whirlwind of change. It sounds like it's been happening so far. So maybe we can safely say, hey, it sounds like they're talking about quadrant 3. Interesting. And I cannot sustain this. You hear the dread a little bit, do you? So we can say that this might be quadrant 4. I'm reaching that breaking point. And by now, hopefully some of you are thinking, it sounds like it's happening right now. Where do you put the right now? We'll get to that, okay? So right now, we'll get to it. So when the person says, I'm reaching that breaking point, you can also hear the dread there, do you? I don't want to let anyone down is another dread. You see, I hope they are following this. And the person says, I just gotta fill my cup. Is that something that they want? Yeah. They want to fill their cup first. And there's so many things. We don't know what this is, so we're going to not mark it yet. That I need to do, maybe it's 1 or maybe 4, because there are a lot of things I need to do that I'm not looking forward to, just like, putting out the garbage or something like that. Yeah, I need to do it, or I want to do. This is more clearly in quadrant 1. And then the person says, you got to be realistic here. We're not sure which quadrant to put in, so we can just leave it blank. Or if you think this can be in multiple quadrants, I just put in X, like the X factor that can turn out to be something else later on. It's pretty cool, isn't it? Now then, what happens is when we talk about possibilities, here's a thing. Both quadrant 1 and 4 can be a possibility. Quadrant 1 is a possible dream. Quadrant 4 is possible dread. And I think I say somewhere in the book that, both dreams and dreads are similar in magnitude, but different in its frequency. And our job is to resonate with the frequency that expands the person's dream, not the dread. And how would you do that if you were to actually build on their dream? See, when you look at this, I cannot sustain this, reaching that breaking point, these are dreads. Do you hear that little bit of dream here? What do they want? They want their cup filled. Fill my cup. And they have so many things that they want to do. Those two are very good choices here that you can actually build on. How would you build on it? Fill my cup first is an option. There's so many things that I want to do. Remember how you responded earlier on in your baseline? What did you pick out on? You picked up on some of these things, or maybe you add your own to respond to this client. But if you actually chose from the client's narrative, which quadrant were you building on and expanding? Isn't that interesting to actually look at? And then here's by the way, we're going through this pretty quick, but you can watch the recording, or you can actually, if you want to know more about it, read more about it, you will learn it. And here's another one. This is one way to look at possibilities so that you can either build on their dream or dread. And you can also build on their sense of progress by looking at some other parts of the narrative. Same narrative here, but I actually made in a darker color for the parts that sounds like something that's been happening in terms of their progress. So when the person says, it's been a whirlwind of change, this is quadrant 3, wasn't it? And some of you might have actually said, tell me more about change. What's been happening? You will be expanding quadrant 3. Well, I can't sustain this, but you can also infer that they would like to sustain it, whatever this might be. And then also you can say, hey, I just got to fill my cup. And what does that look like? So let's say if you are really, your intention is build on their quadrant 1. How would you do that? By just using the client's words. You can say stuff like, suppose your cup is full and getting fuller, actually. How would you know that your cup is getting fuller? Or you can say, what fills your cup? Tell me about a time when you actually felt that your cup was actually full. Suppose your cup is full. What would you do with it? You see, filling my cup is kind of like a metaphor that your client is giving you. And we can really play with it. And guess what quadrant you're going to build on? You can build on quadrant 1 with the same selection of fill my cup. If you intend to build on quadrant 2 using the same narrative, you can say, when have you felt that your cup was full? Fuller than other times. That's resourceful past, isn't it? But with the same selection, you can also expand if you think that's useful. I don't know why you would do that in coaching, but let's say somehow you thought, well, we have to really get to the troubled past. Okay, we can simply then, with the same selection, we can say, hey, tell me about a time. So what actually gets in the way of your cup getting filled? Who is draining your cup? You see how we can actually quickly ruin it too, eh? And then if you want to actually build on quadrant 4 with the same selection, what would you say? Suppose your cup breaks. I don't know, things like to be creative. And that's the beauty of working with a quadrant, because you can pick any words actually out of this narrative, and you can practice building on it. Which quadrant would you like to build? And is it actually building that quadrant? We will know that by looking at what the client says next. Now, all the things I'm telling you is based on communication science. So research piece number 1, when you ask them a question, when you ask a question to anybody, actually, very likely your client will take your assumption and answer it in the direction of your invitation. Is research piece number 1. Research piece number 2, and these are coming from microanalysis of face-to-face conversation, and it's huge research around that. The second research piece that I think is really relevant here is this. Novice coaches who are just maybe starting out or something like that, they're more likely to shoot questions at people rather than sitting there with resonating with what the client just said before you ask a question. For example, if you're just shooting yet another question, very likely you're just kind of starting out your coaching practice. But if you, in your response of your baseline, if you said something like this, wow, it sounds like you've been really going through quite a bit of stuff, eh? Or Canadians will say "eh," but you do use different fillers. But it sounds like you've been really going through a lot, like a whirlwind. Guess what your clients will do? They will say yes. And research piece number 2 is this. If you leave it at that, even your statement might function as "tell me more." So if you leave it at, wow, it's been quite the whirlwind, huh? And then client will say yes, and here's why. So even your statement can function as if you just asked a question. So novice coaches, they shoot question after question, but seasoned practitioners, they use formulations or statements very, very wisely. So sometimes you can actually have a coaching conversation without even asking a single question, simply by using statements. So if you were to do this here, you will say something like this. Wow, so you really want to see your cup filled, huh? Client will say, yes, that would be great because, and they will continue to talk as if you ask them a question. Now, research piece number 3 is this. Seasoned practitioners not only use assumptions and questions really intentionally and also make statements as well as question, but number 3, seasoned practitioners seem to make statements about their bottom quadrants, which is functioning as acknowledging what they're saying, but they ask about the top quadrant. In their statement, they will say stuff like, wow, it sounds like really hard time that you had. Acknowledging, the client will say, yeah, it's been really crazy. And then you then follow up quickly with a question. That's around quadrant 1 and 2. For example, so how have you been coping with all this crazy change? That's a question. Which quadrant do you think that will invite clients to look at if you say that? How have you been coping with all this crazy change so far? Okay? The client will tell you, well, here's how I have been coping. Or if you want to actually ask about quadrant 1 after acknowledging quadrant 3 and 4, you can say something like this. Wow, it sounds like you've been really having a crazy time so far, and you really find it important to fill your cup. And they will say yes and yes. So what do you suppose filling your cup might do that's actually better for you? What difference would that make? Guess what that question is orienting the clients to look at? Quadrant 1. That's pretty cool, no? A little bit complicated. It's okay. It's okay. You can rewind and watch this again. Okay. Now, here's the last little bit I wanted to actually show you. And the last little bit here is, you know what? Maybe I can actually show you something that I actually do with my clients, using something very similar, but here's what I get my clients to do this work. Some of you might be like, do you actually share this with your clients? All the time I do, because I really want them to know what I'm doing, so that this is my agenda, right? So I tell them, here's my agenda. You might want to know what I'm doing here. So I usually teach them this, and this is what I call napkinable idea. You can take a napkin and show them in 5 minutes or less, and they will get it like that. And then after that, I simply give them something like this. You see the tabs on the right is a different color. 5 tabs is different than previous ones, because this is the copy that I give my clients actually. So after we have our initial session, I usually give them these things so that they can do self-coaching. And I'm hoping that you will do this for yourselves too. So here's 2 pages, looking back and looking forward. So here's a timeline. Remember the horizontal line? This is those pages. I ask people to think about, looking back, what are some changes that you have experienced in the past? In the areas of physical, emotional, relational, financial, all these areas of your life that you have experienced. And I let them, I ask them to write down all the changes that they have experienced. On the right-hand side, they're writing down, looking forward, what are some changes that they're anticipating in the future in those areas? And after they write it all down, then I ask them to kind of divide them into their preference, which is top and bottom. Out of all these changes that you experienced so far and you're anticipating, which ones would you prefer to have? And which ones do you not prefer to have? What experiences, interactions, thoughts, feelings, moments, opinions would you prefer and not prefer? You see, in a way, they're mapping their DOQ. So then I get them to, so looking back, here's a resourceful past and troubled past. Looking forward, here's preferred future and dreaded future. I really hope that you do this, by the way, after this session. And you're going to just love doing this activity with your family and teams. And then here's an intervention. And here's the inquiry. When people have written down a few things in each of the boxes, I give them these questions, and I say, answer the question that you resonate with at the moment. And just simply write out some of those responses in your own journal. And for example, if you said something about your preferred future, here are some things that you can ask yourself. As you can see, some words are a little bit darker than others, and those are the words introduced in the book Coaching A to Z, or A to Z, as some of you say. And Coaching A to Z actually has all those small words that we can use, like ordinary words, but you can put it in and people don't even know that it's in there. What was useful about this experience? That's the U word in the book. What are some recent examples of your preferred future already happening? A for already, R for recent. You see that? Especially when people are telling you about their troubled past. You can say, what would you want instead of these experiences? I for instead. Isn't that cool to play with it like this? And this is their self-journal, self-coaching journal, so that I can make myself redundant. And here's the last page that I actually show them. And they're simply checking in. So it's actually scaling on the right-hand side. And those are some areas of their life that they want to work in. And we don't have to go through this today, but here's an example of what I actually give them. And they will score themselves on the scale. And simply they ask themselves, how did I already get here? Where would be good enough for me? And what does good enough look like, sound like, and feel like? And these 5 pages that I showed you with the red tabs are the things that I actually give to my clients to do reflection in between sessions. Oh, and the progress that they make is amazing. And here's a little other thing that I actually get my clients to do, which is the right-hand side. Actually, left-hand side, I tell them, note to self, write down some of the stuff that you want to remember. And on the right-hand side, this is the part that I love. I ask them to go back like many pages in the future in their journal and write down a little note to self, to their future self. So for example, I have a notebook. I do this all the time. I have a notebook I don't know if you can see it. And then I usually, before I start any notebook, I go to the middle of it. And then see, it just opened to the middle. And I actually write myself a note and say, hey, today is this date. And here's a note from my past self. Seriously, by the time you get to that note, you're like, oh my goodness, look at all this I have done. I am. And you celebrate that progress. Anyway, I wanted to show you some of a very basic ways that we can actually use the tool. And I hope that you found it useful. And if you want to know more about it, I highly recommend that you actually join a community practice. It's free to join, and there are a lot of people there. And one thing I love is people get together in your time zones and you organize coaching practice sessions and you practice. I love that piece. Also, there will be a reading group for Coaching A to Z starting in August. So hopefully you can join the community, and that's where I really, really hope to see many of you. Also, starting today, Google, YouTube, some of those coaching demo tapes that other people put, and see if you can actually do DOQ analysis of what the client says, because that's going to say a lot about what the coach is doing with what the client says. And also, please try the journal that I just showed you. And I would love to hear from you how you're using it, and maybe your insights and inquiries and so on. I welcome that. And with that, I think, in closing thought, how will you spell hope? Hey, there you go. And let me actually go to Q&A. And some of you, hey, that's so sweet. You're actually doing this, your activities. Oh, thank you. Cool. Hey, Jeff.
Hey.
I'm so glad that your internet is stable. Great.
Yep, still here. Love listening to you. And we're getting a lot of really great questions. So we definitely want to use the last few minutes that we have to try to get to as many as we can. And if you haven't put a question in the Q&A box, please do. I'm going to move from the chat box because it's much more complicated to go back and forth. So bear with me as we move over to Q&A. But thank you, Haesun. It was extremely thought-provoking. And before I get to the questions, the very first thing came into my mind, and it actually fits with one of the very first questions that comes up. But when you asked us about baseline, what came into my mind immediately was this idea that many of us as coaches want to express empathy. And what I love about what you're framing is that when we think we're expressing empathy, we may very well be taking our client right down into quadrant 3 and 4, right? So I just wanted to acknowledge that even I, as a seasoned coach, have that tendency to, when someone says to me, oh, life is so stressful and I'm so overwhelmed, you know, you immediately want to have empathy. I understand. I know how you feel. Tell me more about that experience. And so for us to be aware of what we're doing as coaches right from the outset, it doesn't mean that we won't get to quadrant 1, which is your point, I think, ultimately, to get people to think about their resources, to think about what they want and to move in that direction. But the question that I always sit with after listening to your talks, which I so appreciate, is how much time do I spend in those lower quadrants with my clients before I get moving, right, into the upper? What you're saying is you can go right for it.
You know, actually, when you look at tapes of people doing coaching that is, let's say, relational and resource focused and so on, actually, we don't ignore quadrant 3 or 4 at all. We acknowledge, but we don't explore. What we explore is 1 and 2, but we do acknowledge 3 and 4 because there's so much valuable things sitting in all quadrants, actually. 1, 2, 3, 4, they're all packaged in a way that people are telling you what they care about. Quadrant 3, troubled past. What I care about is violated, is what they're telling you. Can we hear what they care about? Or do we only hear the violations? Do we only hear the dread and fear? Or do we hear what they're trying to protect here? Quadrant 4, you're trying to protect something. You don't want to lose it. but often we hear only the fear, not the protection. So
Mm.
all 4 quadrants are so useful. And this whole empathy thing is a very funny thing because, I mean, Jeff, think about it. Would you like to talk to somebody who really is listening for what you want, what you care about? Or somebody who's expanding what you don't want and what you don't care about? Empathy
Well,
probably reside with what you care about a little bit more than what you don't care about.
right, right.
So that's my thought.
Well, I think your keyword, and it always comes down in your space to keywords, right, is acknowledgement, right?
Mm.
Not living in those places, but acknowledging, not jumping over. So
Mhm.
that leads me right away to the first question that came up, which fits with what I was thinking about. And the question is, they didn't put a name, it's an anonymous person, but obviously real. How do you support the orientation toward quadrant 1 while acknowledging and holding the challenges that folks may be going through? And I would add the word with compassion or with empathy. What is your suggestion? What would that sound like?
I think one of the stories that come to my mind, I often go to this story because it was very real to me that I was supporting my dad the very day that we got the unexpected diagnosis of stage 4 lung cancer,
Yeah.
terminal.
Wow.
And we all came home and I mean, it was tough. As soon as we heard the news and
Yeah.
my hands were shaking, my stomach, there's a knot, I couldn't eat for 3 days. And that very day, as we are sitting down together in this dark, living room, no one was speaking. And how do we? And I know this, but I couldn't do this. So, in that moment, how do we acknowledge my dad's fear and regrets? Because he was saying, "I should have just got it. I should have checked. I should have checked." That's regret.
Right.
Or when he says, "How long do I have left to live?" That's fear right there. And I actually didn't know how to respond. And the best thing that I could do at the time was acknowledging. I didn't want to be like, "Oh, stay positive." That will be an insult. I think that will be
Right.
so toxic. And then when my dad said, "I really hope that I have like 2 more years, 2 more years." That's quadrant 1 that I heard.
Hmm.
And I could actually respond to that. And I tell you this heart-wrenching story because that really, if something works in your family, you know it works. And that's when I realized that this actually is working in my family. And I got to talk to my dad about, "Dad, I know there are a lot of regrets and so on. And, suppose you have 2 more years. How would you spend the time?" And this conversation happened in 2018. And one of the things that he said he would like to do is, "I want to see you teach." And I said, "Okay, Dad, I'm teaching in Boston. Do you want to come along?" We took a road trip. And both Jeff
With
and
me.
Sue. Yes.
I got to meet him, which was great. It was an
Absolutely.
honor.
And yeah, I know. And I'm so glad that he actually got to experience that. And he still remembers that standing ovation that people gave when I introduced them. And that memory got created because we were able to curate that story in that situation. So thank you for that question. And this is real.
Yeah. No, I think
Absolutely.
it was a very powerful and moving experience, and I was privileged to be with you at Harvard and at the conference and meeting your dad. But what I love about what you're pointing to is that there is a future, and it may be, at the end of the day, it's true for all of us, right? The future is not endless for any of us. Your dad was fortunate to have 2 more years, but we don't know how much time we all have. We could have 2 more days. We could have 20 years. So, being able to have empathy and acknowledging our fragile humanity, and then still moving into that positive place of resourcefulness and what do you want? I think that's really what you're pointing to, which is super powerful.
And when you talk about it, I think it's also when we talk about progress, we keep pushing people forward rather than acknowledging and celebrating. On a scale of 1 to 10, where are you? People might say 2. We want to push them forward and say, where do you need to get to? Versus, how did you come to 2 already? Like, what got you to a 2? You're not a 1.
Right.
That celebration is so incredible because of that reason. We are macro beings with micro becomings. And how do we celebrate those micro becomings, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of questions coming in about your research. And so maybe in the last few minutes that we have, you could share a little bit about how you conduct, because it's really interesting. I've had conversations with you, how you've conducted some of this research and also where people might be able to find some of it.
I love that cats
and this
also
guy
have,
is joining us.
cats have audible utterances too.
He doesn't want to be left out of the conversation.
Sorry.
Anyway, sorry about that.
That's so cute. Oh, there's so many different ways that you can play with this, especially if you're thinking about doing research using this tool. I've done my research using this as, so one thing I can tell you in coaching, especially in this industry of coaching, this is not yet, in my mind, it's not a field that is recognized as a rigorous research field for many different reasons. And I think especially we have a lot of outcome research out there. Like, does it work? Yes, it does. How do we know? Here's how we know. Assessments, and this is how we know. But what's really lacking is process research. A lot of researchers will tell you in coaching field that process research is in dire needs. And process research is not you reflecting on, but really, can you actually reflecting in the moment? So the way that I used it is I used videotapes. So you can catch both audible and visible utterances, not just what you hear, because research shows that a lot of agreements or nods and things like that happens only visibly in conversations.
Right.
If you're only listening to audio, you miss that. 80%, more than 80% of times, you check for other people listening to, like, do you understand what I'm saying? People nod. It's not recorded on audio. So always use video recordings and analyze questions. What kind of assumptions do I have? And in questions, what kind of assumptions do you hear in those questions? And very likely your client is always responding to these assumptions and directions of those questions. Another research that we can do in the same sort of research project is look at what the client says and do analysis. And you can do this with your session right now, actually. Record your session and see what the client says. Just do a DOQ map, just like what we did, and see what you actually respond to. What piques your curiosity? Very likely, untrained mind gets so interested in quadrant 3 and 4 because that has survival value. But how do we shift the conversation? Where does your client look at after your intervention? And that will be a brilliant research to do. Anyway, I just can't go on and on about research. Sorry.
No, but I think it's important that people, do you have any recommendations for where people can find articles that you've written about this or further?
Yes, there are a few. You know what? I'll share a few. Okay. There are some more academic ones, but especially there are microanalysis of face-to-face dialogue research by Jen Baveles, Sarah Healing, and all these amazing researchers doing communication research in healthcare setting is brilliant. So I can share some of those things too, but mostly their research is in therapeutic setting, but you can totally apply that to your coaching research as well. So if you want to do, if you want to just search that, you will find a lot of things actually online, but also share a few different ones that are my favorite ones.
That's great.
Yeah.
Do you want to quickly put up your last slide with the contact information in the group? Because people are asking about your group and your...
Sure, yeah.
Just quickly put that slide up.
So let me see.
Yeah, the left side.
You're going to actually get the slides as PDF, so you can just, look at it as well. And I think community practice is what I really, really recommend that you're joining, because there's a lot of things happening. Coaching A to Z group is happening in August, meow. And also really coaching practice sessions. It's almost like every day people are doing something in the world in your time zone. So you can join in and do intentional practice, not just another coaching session, but intentional practice. After you practice, you analyze it together, which is amazing. So do something with it. Just don't think about it, do it. and you're going to learn so much, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you
If
so
you have
much,
questions,
Haesun.
please email learn@briefcoaching.ca, and yeah, just email.
Yes, definitely stay in touch with Haesun if you have more. And I want to encourage you to go out and get this book, which I regularly refer to. And I will, as part of our thank you, I will share with you one of my favorite pieces.
Oh.
So the letter Y. When you talk about starting a question or a statement and adding the word yet, right? I love that. So Haesun's book goes through the entire alphabet, and the letter Y. Conversations can position your conversation partner to be their own witness. People can watch their own arrival at their preferred destinations. So when you ask someone, how are you? Are you there yet? I love that. Thank you for that, Haesun. It's great.
And especially if you have teenagers, when they say, I don't know, hear it as I don't know yet. That's going to make some difference in your relationships.
Right. Just the one word can make a huge
Absolutely.
impact.
Yeah.
And I can honestly say from my own experience that I have done, now that we're doing Zoom coaching, ask your client if he minds or she minds if you record the session on Zoom and then go back and look at the DOQ and where you spent your energy in questioning and where the client. It's really, really enlightening and incredibly helpful for coaching to hone in where you want to move the client toward their preferred future. So, and with that, I want to thank you so much for joining us, Haesun, and thank everyone from joining us from all around the world. And this recording will be available within the next 2 or 3 days. So feel free to use it as a resource and stay in touch with us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Haesun. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.